I'm Michael Kelleher, Director of the Windham-Campbell Prizes at Yale University. Welcome to the 2021 Windham-Campbell Prizes Virtual Festival. We'll be streaming a new episode each week for the next 9 Wednesdays. Each episode will focus on one of this year's prize recipients, and the final episode will be a keynote address by U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo. While the episodes stream, you'll be able to chat with other audience members, and following the live stream, we invite you to join the writer in a live Zoom Q&A. In the week between each episode, there will be plenty of on-demand content available for you to enjoy. Today's episode features Kate Briggs, translator and author of This Little Art. She will be joined in a wide-ranging conversation about translation and writing by Sawako Nakayasu, Johannes Göransson, and Windham-Campbell Prize recipient John Keene.
I'm here with Sawako, John, and Johannes, and I'm going to ask you to briefly just tell us who you are.
I'm Sawako Nakayasu, and I'm a poet, translator, and occasional performance artist.
I'm John Keene. I'm a poet, fiction writer, translator, professor, and I don't do a lot of performance art, but I do other little art projects involving language.
Hey, I'm Johannes Göransson, and I'm a poet and a translator, and I edit Action Books, which publishes a lot of books in translation.
So, you know, the three of you are clearly all translators, also poets, artists, writers, publishers, activists, educators who've written extensively about translation as well as doing translation. And my invitation to you was to see if we could kind of make a space of conversation and speculation together in this kind of strange Zoom space, just for the time that we have. And more specifically, I invited you to think about reading aloud as a form of publication and kind of a way of making public, maybe temporary, only in a temporary way or more ephemerally, what it might mean to republish each other's work or bits of each other's work, or lines from each other's work that resonate with us. What it might mean to hear our own work kind of voiced back to us by each other. And in this way to see if we might, through juxtaposition and contrast and maybe contradiction, kind of write something together. But more than anything, I would also like this to feel like very much a shared space.
I just want to riff on what you just said, Kate, because you used the words republishing and writing together in reference to us having a conversation and reading out loud each other's works. And that makes me think of how interesting it is to think about translation broadly and through contexts that are not necessarily in book publication. And so the idea that our conversation, even as a recording, is a republication and a writing together seems like a nice place to enter for me.
I was just thinking, thinking about the news right now, and just, we're talking about, we've been sort of thinking through translation, particularly literary translations, but thinking about translation as a life and death matter. We think on an everyday basis, in courts and hospitals, but we also think about the, Afghan translators. I mean, this is, right now, their plight is kind of at the forefront of public conversations of translation, and just so thinking about translation in this broader, richer sense, right? But coming back to kind of the spaces and places that each of you have opened up in your work is to me quite fascinating.
There's a moment in Sawako's pamphlet, which is a sequence of, or a treatise, a literary treatise, which is a sequence of propositions or speculations about translation. That's certainly how I read it. And one of them is, say translation in email, say translation with parents, translation at the kitchen table. And that seems to me to speak to what John was just saying about these forms of translation, which are kind of happening, are active all the time, everywhere, in all these different highly charged, high stakes or low stakes in contexts, which don't take the form or end up in the form as a kind of published translation product in a kind of literary sphere, but are nevertheless kind of partaking of the activity of translation. And I really, translation at the kitchen table speaks to me very clearly, very resonantly, as well as the other forms of action that might take place in the non-public sphere and wouldn't necessarily reach it, but is still of value.
I was thinking about the Afghan translator. When you mentioned that, I just started thinking about all the translations. The same thing happened, of course, elsewhere, like in Iraq. The translators were targeted from many directions with at least suspicion. Yeah, in Guantanamo, famously, Americans thought that the translators must be smuggling secrets in and out because they couldn't understand them.
So like the translator as a translator as a kind of collaborator, which in fact is true, right?
Yeah,
in a sense, it is true, but depending on how you define collaborator and define truth. But yeah, that's fascinating.
I mean, the translation creates socialities, I guess. Then if he's a collaborator, I mean, collaborate in the sense of collaborator with the foreign government, but then maybe there's a relationship to the way translation is a collaborator and sets up, sociality and intersection between writers as well. So there's like a contagious collaborativeness going on, and this might be why there's something suspicious, crossing boundaries in a way that is suspicious, and you obviously see in these kind of political realm, but I find echoed in literary realm, where the translator is always suspected of smuggling things in or translating things that in an incorrect way. You talk a lot about that in your book, Kate. This like constant suspicion of the translator that goes along with that crossing of boundaries.
Translation is clearly, to my mind, I think to all of our minds, a collaborative process with a tricky, interesting power dynamic built into it. But I also think of writing, certainly the books I want to write as being these kind of spaces which I hope are about kind of bringing in materials and experiences and voices that are not solely my own. They're also spaces of conversation and collaboration. But I think that is the kind of the notion, maybe to come to Sawako's title, Say Translation is Art. I think what that does, it seems to me, is a double thing of, on the one hand, opening a kind of speculation, a kind of what-ifness around translation, this idea that it might not already be determined in advance. If translation is art, then my understanding, art is something whose terms precisely can't be determined in advance. It can't already be decided what counts as it. And so it puts translation in that space of openness and possibility. But on the other hand, it also proposes a challenge to, I think, art making, because if translation is art, then art becomes collaborative and maybe messy and maybe suspicious, and certainly no longer or not so easily kind of focused on the single kind of independent, self-authored kind of maker. I don't know if that resonates with you as the writer of this extraordinary thing.
Well, I want to think about that in alongside the things that John and Johannes were mentioning about translation and interpretation and power, and how different kinds of values are assigned to different instances of language transfer. And there's something, for me, art is an umbrella, but it's also a paradigm that opens up translation to many more directions than are possible within what increasingly seems to me like a really narrow, inherited practice of literary translation. And so something I find interesting in the way all of our work intersects with each other is how we're all interested in opening up space. Like we all do the similar thing, that's literary translation, but we're all trying to push it outwards in different directions. And to that end, thinking about interpreters and sort of people who are active in really contested spaces in real time, and thinking about that in conjunction with art that is made in real time in live spaces, and then triangulating that with the notion of making a book or a product, and where those things intersect or collapse or just butt against each other. I think that's where I'm interested in exploring.
So Sawako writes, say vomit, say gagging, say choking translation, say I spent the entire summer of 2020 with a low-grade fever and endless nausea, say this vomit-inducing country translation, say my younger body drinking alcohol, body rejecting even a small amount by vomiting. They say women have trouble saying no. I envied my body's clarity in vomit translation. Say race and racism, quiet translation of say in Asia, I learned to better understand it, to talk freely. Say in 2017, I returned to where I am from and learned anew how to speak, how not to say the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong time. Say translating myself into silence, into poetry. Say a book full of translated vomit, gagging, choking. Say in the before of translation is silence. Say in the after of translation is silence. From Kate. And then this might be somewhere along the way towards what Deleuze is saying in his essay too, in relation to what he'll come to offer as a third option available to or thrust by circumstance upon the writer, which would be neither to announce it exactly nor quite to perform it, but to write in such a way that would make the language itself stutter and stammer, to write perhaps in the way Hans Castorp speaks French. And Johannes says, the model of the deformation zone rejects the communication ideal by positing that poetry and its translation are in transgressive circulation, pulling readers and writers into an unsettling flux. As Socrates pointed out, transgressive circulation is in large part an issue of power, the foreign text's power over our bodies. As such, a number of other power issues are involved. U.S. literature's emphasis on agency and interiority necessarily needs to control the influence of the foreign. One aspect of this anxiety is a dominant communication-based ideal in which the reader of a poem remains in control. The reader accesses the meaning of the poem, thinking and wondering how to stutter poetry, thinking and wondering how to stutter poetry, thinking and wondering how desires armor her, how the paper enfold or position yearning, thinking and wondering, stutter, poetry, in public as quiet, without power or armor, the backs of her poems struck silent, stuck and lost so, are scooping up and working that out of shy and felt and separate. How do they stand? To sheer poetry, share it, stutter, poetry, thinking, wondering, dreaming, thinking, stuttering, poetry.
Thanks for that, John. I want to jump in and read some things too. And I'm thinking about the stuttering and the physical, visceral aspects of this conversation and where this is leading for me, or one of the vectors I see opening up. And this is what I pulled from Johannes's transgressive circulation. Quote, foreign texts are not just threatening because they bring foreign ideas into the target culture. They may, in fact, ruin the entire system of literature through sheer excess. Translation may make too many texts so that we may not be able to tell the good from the bad, and thus we may not be able to sell it. Translation is a battalion engine. Translation, like poetry, creates waste. I want to linger on this notion of making too many texts, and that having too many breaks the system and breaks the system of goodness and great work. And once that's broken, you can't sell it. And once you can't sell it, then it's free. It's a freeing of literature, and it opens up just a vastness of how to approach living life with language and text and literature. So I I found that moment so enormously liberating for me and exciting, and also has me thinking about some things that I'm seeing more of lately that are books by people who are translating, but the choice of what they translate is opening up, kind of like in response to your essay, John, about translating Blackness and translating literature from the Black diaspora. Even if they are not doing exactly that, there are other younger translators. I'm thinking of E.J. Ko and how she translated the letters that her mother wrote to her in Korean when they left for Korea and left the children behind in the US. And that people are translating things that were not originally intended as literature. And so that's kind of breaking apart the system of great literary work being translated into another work of great literature. And we're seeing just a range of texts becoming possible as literature. And I think even though these books are still being produced and sold, I think that there is a different way in which we can approach the whole concept of translating and making a book out of it.
I think, just to add to that, I think there's something, what you were saying about earlier about surplus and excess and too muchness and and vomit and waste. And I think too many texts, but also the sense of translation, the anxiety around translation, there being too many bodies in the way, in fact. Like there's been, I would like this unmediated access to this apparently original, what's been put in the position of this kind of original work, and translation puts another body in the way and another sensibility and situation in the way.
I just want to put in the space the story you told. An English-speaking friend tells me about reading Calvino, a writer whom he loves, Cosmic Comics in particular, and how often he goes back to read the stories that make up that book and how badly he wants to believe. And in fact, the degree to which he does believe, despite the translator's name on the frontispiece, that it was Italo Calvino who handled the words that he is now reading, who wrote them for him. A naive misconception or an active self-deception? On many levels, you might say, this romantic attachment to monographic, single-handed authorship, this fantasy of unmediated address, and with it, underlying it and enabling it, my friend's serene failure to notice, let alone to name the translator. There's something about that passage and that description and that kind of passionate love that I found really interesting, because these modes of loving, I'm finding increasingly troubled and troubling because they seem untouchable. Like, you can't tell me I don't love Italo Calvino. And the way that you bring the notion of love, of passionate love, into a conversation about how we engage with literature, I think is useful in the same ways that love is one of those things that power is always mediating and controlling, which is brilliantly discussed in your book, Johannes, about the erotics of translation, and that reading language is like being devoured by it, and you're being like it's infiltrating your body. I found that really wonderful how you put it, and that's part of why it's so fraught, and people are so upset about the potential of one's conception of love being tampered with.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just thinking about Sawako, what you're saying, and your reference to Johannes's work, and what Kate is saying about this, again, this question of bodies, and when you think about the corporeality of translation, right? You take language into your body and you transmute it into this new thing. And of course, this attachment with Calvino, unmediated, has to erase not just, of course, the translator, unless you read, Calvino in the original, but also the entire apparatus of publishing, right? You think about we all know this, right? All of the people involved, right? At every stage, right, of publishing, right? And just, of course, once the work enters the world, all these other bodies, this proliferation of bodies, this excess, that's always there. But, there is the illusion that it isn't. So I think it's foregrounding that, calling attention to that. And as Sawako was saying, thinking about how that operates in relation to a kind of love for a writer, and I say this, we all say this, I love this writer. Maybe sometimes we hate this writer. we usually don't acknowledge all of those other bodies, those people, right? As Johannes was saying earlier, the entire social field that makes any work of literature itself, art possible, right?
Mm-hmm. If I can, this is from John. My translation work profoundly informs my own creative activity because it reminds me that the models which predominate and prevail in the US are not universal or the limits of what is possible. I just relate, that resonates with me in relation to exactly what you're saying, like forms of translation that might do that work of reminding rather than doing that work of conforming, like that these are not the only forms of expression, these are not the only languages in which writing gets written, these are not the only forms of experience. And and that relationship too between translation work and other forms of creative activity, that translation is not this kind of bounded field. I think in my understanding of it, for any of us, it's actually I think for me, it's the foundation of any other kind of writing work that I might do, through the fact that it has this relational quality, this kind of always already a form of writing with, rather than it's not ever solely about self-expression, it's always about being in relation and being in some kind of complex relationship with the other materials, the existing materials that are in the world. In one, just a very small, to fragment a moment in, say, translation is art, say remote translation, say close translation, say nomad translation, say constantly in flux translation, say real-time translation, say incomplete translation, say translation in progress, say slow translation, say instant translation, say infinite duration translation, say mouthful of translation, body full of translation, translation in spite of and within the limitations of body, time and space. Of all of those modes, I think there's the infinite duration translation is the one that when I read that, I felt operated as a descriptor of me and my own practice of being in a relation to a work that you have rewritten, you've remade, you're engaged with, you have feel complicatedly about, and in a relation that actually has this kind of infinite duration that doesn't seem to let you go, or you're not willing to let it go. Does that speak to the rest of you, like the temporalities of certain kinds of translation relationships that you find yourself in, or translation engagements that you find yourself in that have this durational quality, or maybe potentially this kind of lifelong quality?
Part of me was thinking about how long it took for me to translate this one poet, Chikasagawa. And I spent many, many years working on one version of the translation, and then spent 1 month making a different version of my translation with her. So I was already interested in that scale of long and short, but I'm also interested in just the powerful force of new criticism and the pressure to close read a poem, and that the close reading is the sort of established and most important way to read a poem, whereas my experience with poetry is a lot more vast than that, and many different experiences are to be had in reading poetry. And so I think those experiences as a poet led to my transferring them over to a practice of translation, and that I might be spending a long time translating something, and I might also translate that same thing in a day.
I think it's just so fascinating to hear you talk about, the amount of time that you've spent on certain translations, because I think, in my mind, when I think of Sawako, I think, you're someone who actually is able to translate very quickly. And it got me to thinking about, one of the things in terms of this relates to the body, emotion, is for me, sometimes fear, right? Fear of the limits of my knowledge, right? And coming to accept those limits. I was just thinking, recently I translated a poem by the Afro-Cuban poet Jesus Coscase, and a friend had sent me this poem over 10 years ago. But in my mind, I kept saying, you don't know Spanish well enough to translate this poem. And for whatever reason, I was drawn back to this poem, and I sat down and translated. And I realized, I mean, except for maybe a few words, I knew I could read it. I could read it, of course, but I found a language for it. It was almost like I had to sit with this poem in a sense, and both in the foreground and the background for this long period of time. And now, of course, when I read the English translation, when I reach the end, I feel almost teary, right? Because it moves me so powerfully. But I think part of that is, part of it is engaging with the poem itself and with what I have produced, right? Which is not, which is and is not what Koskase wrote, but also sort of overcoming that fear of speaking, of stuttering, right? Of stammering, of not being understood, right? Of feeling like an imposter, right? In trying to share this work.
I really liked your description at the end of the talk in Chicago, where you talk about, call it blackness, call it diaspora, knowing something is always lost in the process just as much as something is born, transferred and transformed with care and in struggle, leaving its traces as we see each other, as we read each other, as we speak each other, holding each other up gently and fiercely, daring to call this process translation. That seems like a very almost idyllic, even though it has struggled, it seems like an idyllic alternative to, like the world of the perfect translation and mastery and things existing in a vacuum. And I was also thinking when I read that, because it comes at the very end of your essay, and I wonder, it imagines some kind of sociality or art as a collaborative and communal space. But I feel like translation, the mistakes that this acknowledges is what makes it feel like a translation-based idea of sociality, if that makes sense, as opposed to in poetry you often hear these idealized ideas of community, but it always struck me as really closed off and like unnecessarily exclusionary, whereas the translation here with the struggles and the interactions, and it seems like maybe I don't know if translation has I guess the question now is like, does translation have the possibility of forging socialities that are not closed off, or does it have them? Maybe the translation has in itself, or a certain approach to translation has the possibility of opening up American poetry to this like diasporic writing, because I mean I have had different relationships with translation, and some of them feels really closed off, especially when I was very young, and it felt like the translation world wanted to eliminate me or something. When I read that, I felt like maybe translation has this possibility to generate a less closed off idea of sociality, and that kind of volatile sociality will allow for like African diasporic writing, for example, to be more engaged with.
I want to try to continue what you're saying, Johannes, because it feels really important when you were talking about it being exclusionary. And at some point you said you felt they wanted to eliminate you. And when you said that, it reminded me of multiple friends that I have who speak another language. It's a heritage language, who took a translation class and was put off by the instructor of the class having a certain set of values around translation, which often tend to be conservative, let's say, and that it cut them off. It made them feel that they were not good enough, qualified enough, however fit they thought they needed to be. It was not opening the door at all. And I think there's an anxiety already that we inherit from the culture about translation, and then to enter a formal space that also espouses those values. Any emerging translator has to kind of fight through so much potential critique that it might not seem worth it. And that makes it a lost opportunity that I think we could really stand to try to change those avenues through which one enters translation.
One thing that, if I may, I feel like our work shares, or the impulse behind a portion of our work shares, has to do with this permission giving. This kind of affirmation of saying, like, did you know that translation can begin? You know, like John, you spoke about not daring. Like, did you know that you can start, like, with what you have? Perhaps you already have enough. Perhaps you don't already have enough, in which case you will learn. You are capable of learning what you might need to educate yourself to know in order to have enough. But that doesn't need to be given in advance. I think for a long time I felt this sense of this being me sort of interloping in this kind of guarded elite space of not being enough, like how dare I and wanting to, at least in the book, to sort of try, if nothing else, to kind of open up an invitation to say, did you realize that you can also do this? I collaboratively initiate a reading writing group called Short Pieces That Move, which is all about poetry, really. And our mode of it's so affirmative, our mode of responding to each other. We've been doing it online on a Rise Up pad during COVID, this kind of online writing tool. And it's all about anyone writes anything, and it's like love hearts, you know, like wow, like kind of an overlay of that's amazing. And I've been thinking about that as a kind of what that means pedagogically, like for it to be total affirmation. And the more I think about it, the more I'm committed to it, actually, at that stage of, for me, myself included, total fragility. You know, like we really are doing something that feels very, very risky and very, very exposing. And it's not the moment to begin critiquing whether or not we have a right to do it, whether or not what we've done makes any sense, whether or not it's worthy according to some kind of norms of what a poem might be. It's the moment to say, there was nothing when we started this session 2 hours ago, and now look, in Rise Up, it's all multicolored. You know, now we have all of these different colored bits of writing that didn't exist before, and that is something. You know, maybe that's excessive and messy. It's really messy and really kind of probably also really awful. You know, like maybe according to some other standards, but it didn't exist before, and now it does. And the translation-based sociality might have to start with saying that, did you know? Have we begun to recognize the forms of translation that are already happening? Do we know how to value them? Do we know how to value the forms of bilingualism and trilingualism that are already extant everywhere in all kinds of spaces? Do we know how to see them? Do we know that translation happens if someone sits down to do it?
Okay,
that's great. That's really well put.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think your book is a great example of giving permission and opening space, extending the invitation to enter from where you are. And we just haven't had enough examples of that.
Thank you for saying that. It's amazing to hear. I love this translation-based sociality. That's what we're doing. We didn't know what we were going to do together, but we're going to invent it. Do we have thoughts on how that might happen?
One way we might think about this is, what are different kinds of spaces and venues, places where we can share some of these thoughts and ideas, right, that are not the usual spaces, right? So what happens if, for example, at what is expected to be let's say a poetry reading, we, part of it is our poetry and part of it is, where we say to people, okay, here, this is also going to be a conversation about translation and sharing some of this marvelous work that you all have written with people who are not, let's say, exactly expecting it. I'm thinking about, venues online. Where are those places and spaces online where might open the door? And I mean, you're already doing this, right? So I love how you talk about, with a kind of reading group where you're encouraging people, and it is not a space, it's a space of affirmation. It's a space of understanding vulnerabilities and taking those into account. I think, where can we find those new places and spaces to do some of this work and share it? And acknowledging that it is not going to be easy. There may be struggle, right? And acknowledging that struggle is part of it. And that this is all part of of translation as process, translation as art, as art.
So the translation-based sociality might be a space of kind of sitting with the likelihood of getting it wrong, or it being all right, having a calmness with getting it wrong, and also maybe also with provisionality. This is all right for now. This is what I can venture for now. This is what I can do for now, what we can do together. And maybe on that note, aware of your time and the pressures of your time. This is what we've done together for now. It's turned out something different from what I imagined, but how could I determine in advance what this would be like? But I feel like it's been really, and powerfully meaningful for me, seriously, to just be listening to you and talking with you for this time. And now, really, it's I'm so grateful for your words and your thoughts and just what you've shared. It was really like a life highlight level. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
Likewise,
all of you.
thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Kate,
you.
John, Johannes.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah.
Yeah.
Continue.
Yeah, to be continued, I hope. Thank you.
We're going to end today's episode with a short reading. But before we do, I'd like to invite you to a live Zoom conversation immediately following the episode.
So I'm going to read some pages from my book, This Little Art, which is a book about the practice of literary translation, but also very much about the last lecture courses of Roland Barthes, which I translated, as you'll hear in the pages that I'm going to read. I've expanded on them a little bit, as I often do when I'm reading aloud. I annotate and modify them a little bit for the purposes of this reading. So, I like salad, cinnamon, cheese, pimento, marzipan, roses, peonies, lavender, champagne, realistic novels, writes Roland Barthes famously in a paragraph of a book titled Roland Barthes, translated by Richard Howard. I don't like women in slacks, geraniums, strawberries, the harpsichord. Who cares, he asks, after writing this list of likes and dislikes out like a poem. None of this is of any consequence to anyone whatsoever. It's all apparently meaningless. And yet all this means, or more literally, all that it wants to say is, my body is not the same as yours. I have always wanted to. I have always experienced the desire, the impulse to find arguments for, to argue around or out from or on the basis of my moods, my feelings, my impulses, my humours. J'ai toujours eu envie d'argumenter mes humeurs, writes Barthes in La Chambre Claire, a sentence part translated by Richard Howard in Camera Lucida as, I have always wanted to remonstrate with my moods. I want to argue with Howard here, conscious that my own translations would find such local scrutiny hard to bear. I'm not sure that the thought invites the with, as if humours, moods, was something Barthes wanted to talk himself out of or object to. I have always wanted, or felt, to argue out from my moods, is what I'd venture he wrote. And then, continuing the sentence in Howard's translation, not to justify them, still less to fill the scene of the text with my individuality, but on the contrary, to extend this individuality to a science of the subject, a science whose name is of little importance to me, provided that it attains, as has not yet occurred, to a generality which neither reduces nor crushes me. This proposition, to start out from how things are for oneself, to speak out from one's own subject position, of interest if only for the reason that we are, each of us, so wholly unrepresentative. The example of Roland Barthes in his standing, his popularity by the mid-1970s, lecturing at the Collège de France, but also by the time of the last lecture course, in his grief as he mourned the death of his mother. Not to start out from, but not in order to remain there. On the small stage he may now have flooded with his own individual concerns, his list of likes and dislikes, but as a means of reaching out toward our more shared questions. All of this might be one way of getting at the broader project of Barthes' 3 lecture courses. I will lecture from here, Barthes tells us from the very beginning. I will induce outward from my own fantasies. The fantasy of a small-scale community offering the ideal negotiation of interpersonal distance, of companionship and solitude, the fantasy of the neutral as a non-conflictual way of being in the world, and in the last years, the fantasy of writing a novel that would finally speak of and for the ones you love. Let me tell you something then. Let me tell you something that has happened to or how things are for me. Let me offer some sliver from life, from my private or fantasy life, as a place to start thinking together from. And in the telling, it will become apparent, the hope, the risk, the wager is that it will become apparent that just as there will be something to extrapolate and also to research, something to identify and investigate as being of likely concern and consequence to others as well as to me, there will also be a remainder, a leftover part, a residue in the circumstance or the detail or the phrasing or the something that is unglossable. The effort to reach for the general in such a way as to neither reduce nor crush, in the hope that no one will feel reduced nor crushed, and so in such a way as to make no promise of a final theory, no totalizing claim with respect to the shared questions that the lecture courses were, nevertheless, deeply invested in asking, was for Butt a way of trying, in one's teaching, to attenuate the power and the arrogance of language, to analyze dogmatism, and to try not to practice it oneself. The writer and teacher Lucia Mara, in her discussion of this project, points to a moment in the course on the neutral, translated by Rosalind Krauss and Denis Ollier, where Barthes considers a range of strategies for offering what he calls beside-the-point answers. Consider the formats of the round table or the interview, he asks, and the kind of impossibly vast and grandiose questions that get asked there, the kinds of questions from which our social and political life is excessively woven. Questions like, is there a writing specific to women and to men? Do you think that the writer seeks the truth? The big universalizing question with its expectation of a big universalizing answer. Questions like, what is a translation? And how to translate well? And what is a good translation? I don't know. Actually, I don't know. If nothing else, I know that I'm not in a position to answer for everyone. Imagine now, says Barthes, to questions such as these, big, impossible questions demanding some generalizing, authoritative, public response, offering an answer that is entirely beside the point, such as, look, the sky is blue like an orange, or I bought this shirt at Lavan's, or let's say, if the question were put to you in public, standing up, taking off a shoe, putting it on your head, and leaving the room. Writing from the first person, he suggests, is its own different, perhaps more moderate, more likely strategy of being always somewhere beside the point, of indirection. As Barthes will come to assert, I is a method, part of a general effort to change what he calls the rhetorical conditions of the intellectual, to expand and vary of what it's possible to speak and in what manner, in the hope of neither reducing nor crushing. I'd say, Barthes says, in the first lecture of the last lecture course, that I'm of a generation that has suffered too much from the censoring of the subject in the intellectual field. And I would say, insist, better the lures and traps of subjectivity than the impostures of objectivity. So let me presume to tell you how things are for me. I like the mornings, nasturtiums, cosmos, daffodils, marmite, the sea. I don't like motorways, ketchup, sudden sounds like doors banging, being filmed. This is of no consequence, I realize. What to whom does it matter? This arbitrary and partial list. All it wants to say is our bodies are different. It says merely, minimally, I register this. My body, my thinking, reading, writing, translating, living body is not the same as yours.